some more. In the meantime, while they're doing that, turn in your Bibles to 2 Peter chapter 3. I want to start there. If you got your handout, you're seeing that this is our third lesson in our series of the Bible and science. We looked, of course, at a more general lesson, and we began the series with astronomy. We looked last month at oceanography. Now, of course, looking at geology. 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter writes this by inspiration. This second epistle, beloved, I now write unto you, in both which I stir up your pure minds by way of remembrance, that you may be mindful of the words which were spoken before by the holy prophets, and of the commandment of us, the apostles of the Lord and Savior, knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts or their own desires, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. For this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. But the heavens and the earth, which are now by the same word, are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. But, beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in the which the heavens shall pass away with great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. The earth also and the works that are therein shall be burned up. Seeing then that all these things shall be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in all holy conversation and godliness, looking for and hasting unto the coming of the day of God, wherein the heavens being on fire shall be dissolved, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. And of course, he goes on to mention we look for a new heaven and a new earth. This world's going to be destroyed one day, but there were folks in Peter's time that were like folks today. They had a misunderstanding of the whole scheme of God's earth. Geology involves a study of the history of this earth, the composition, the forces that have worked upon it, and, of course, the remains of ancient plants and animals. We had leftovers, all right. Everybody get one? Anybody get? Oh, got a couple back there. You can just set those right there. That'll be fine. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. So geology basically is studying the history of the earth. Whether it be the composition, there's a lot of study of rocks, of course. It may be forces working upon the earth that have worked upon the earth, so forth. Geology was kind of a fledgling field of study until the advent of Darwinism. And even now, there's a lot of speculation that goes on now. We'll just say that. And allegedly, geology is a study of the Earth's biography. Sometimes you'll hear geologists or sometimes scientists make statements like that. This is the biography of Earth. It's found in the rocks and in the geology of the Earth. A lot of people claim geology is just proof positive that evolution did happen. I think you'll see as we go through this study that's far from being the case. There are others, however, they're honest enough to say, whoa, time out, don't be trying to say that geology is proof positive of evolution, because it's anything but. But you have some that will try to take it and use it as proof for certain that evolution has occurred. Canyon, I've been privileged to go to the Grand Canyon once. I was just, 20-something, I guess, early 20s. I was in college, and a buddy of mine was going to grad school in Colorado, so he and another guy and we piled into his Toyota Camry with everything he owned, which wasn't much, of course. He was just graduating college. And we just made it into a big road trip. And so off we went, and we stopped at several historic sites and things like that along the way. And one of the places we went to was the Grand Canyon. Unfortunately, we were in the process of moving him out there, so we couldn't just take as long as we'd like, and that was just one stop of many. So I didn't get to stay there nearly as long as I would like. But you can see, hopefully in this picture, we'll look at the better image here. Oh yeah, that's much better. You can see those layers, strata, they're called, of the earth, right? Billions of years of time, just evidenced right there in each layer. That's what a lot of scientists would tell you. Problem is, if you'll pardon my grammar, it just ain't so. And I think you'll see as we go through this study, there are a lot of assumptions built into a lot of geological study. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. You see the three major points we're looking at there on your handout, and we'll look at those and break those down and just see what does the evidence point toward. That's what we've always tried to say on all of these. We're looking to see where does the evidence take us. I'm not going to sit here and tell you, well, here's what it is simply because the Bible says so. Now, we understand there's evidence for the Bible's inspiration, and we could study that and see that is a compelling argument because the evidence is there that the Bible is the inspired Word of God. But we're also going to go and look at evidence from the earth itself and see and understand that the evidence points toward, it's more in harmony with the creationist account, and especially as it pertains to a global, worldwide flood thousands of years ago. Notice, first of all, and you see this if you got your handout, divergent doctrines. I mean, there are a lot of words we could put here: divergent, diametrically opposed doctrines. There are two worldviews that are 100% in complete opposition to one another. This is something to keep in mind, by the way, when you are tempted to compromise, as some folks decide they're going to compromise and say, well, maybe God used evolution. Maybe he made the raw materials and then just sort of let evolution take over. Well, that's a whole other sermon for another time. I'll just say that. But one of the main reasons, one of many reasons why that won't work, it's just impossible, is these divergent doctrines. When you come at the Bible as being truthful, you're looking at a completely different worldview than someone who is looking at the world and saying, God had nothing to do with this. There is no special creation. Two fundamentally different doctrines, viewpoints, worldviews, however you want to word that separate the creationist from the evolutionist. And here's what they are. You've probably heard these before. Hopefully you have. The first one is called uniformitarianism. Now, that's a mouthful, but you see the root word in there, I'm sure. The root word is uniform. Everything has been and is the same. When you wear a uniform, you're going to look the same as someone else who works for that same company, or maybe it's a school uniform that goes to the same school. They're all going to look at least very similar. That's the idea here. It's the idea that the features that we see on earth as they are resulted from gradual change over a long period of time. I mean, supposedly billions of years. Not just millions, billions. Remember, when it comes to evolution, the quote is not original with me, but I've read it numerous times, and it's so true. Time is the hero of the plot. They figure the idea is if you give enough time, anything could happen, even spontaneous generation of life. And eventually that spontaneous one-celled organism could, given enough time, turn into a walking, breathing, thinking, reasoning human being. Now, I've said before, I'm not that foolish. I'm not the most intelligent person on this earth by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm not that dumb. You can give all the time you want, but life doesn't come from non-life, ever. It just doesn't. But that's the idea. The Earth's features as they are now resulted from gradual change over a long, drawn-out period of time. The slow processes we see now are indicative of past forces of nature. The rates of erosion that we see now are assumed to be, guess what? The rates of erosion 200 million years ago as well. And sometimes people will look at the current rates of erosion and say, oh, well, based on this and seeing how much shoreline has been eroded, or something like the Grand Canyon, they're kind of getting away now. They're finally starting to figure out that the Grand Canyon probably more likely linked to a catastrophic event of some kind. I wonder what that might be. But they said for a long, long time, when I was growing up, we were taught the Grand Canyon was carved by the Colorado River over millions of years of time. Because at the rate the Colorado River is currently meandering through that gorge, it would take millions of years to carve through all that rock and make a canyon that in some places is over a mile wide. But you see the assumption that's built into that? The assumption is it's always been that way. And it hasn't. There's no evidence that it's always been that way. The favorite phrase of uniformitarianism is, the present is the key to the past. If you want to understand the past rates of erosion, the past processes of Mother Earth, look at the present, and you'll understand that, according to them. That's that whole worldview. The other one, the other worldview or viewpoint, is called catastrophism. Now again, that's a word we probably don't use every day, but you can, once again, I'm sure, see the root word there, catastrophe. It's the idea that not the features as they are now is what they've always been. It's the idea that the earth has been subject to violent and even global, worldwide changes in the past. The most significant of which would be, of course, the Genesis flood of Noah's day, a worldwide global flood. The question then becomes, which of these fits the facts better? And that's what we're talking about tonight. That's the whole point of this study. Does the evidence point toward uniformitarianism, or does the evidence point toward catastrophism? Which is it? There's something ironic here. I don't remember if I had this on the handout or not, but Charles Darwin, he started pushing really hard for this idea of uniformitarianism. The present is the key to the past. The way it is now is the way it's always been. But of course, what Darwin ends up speculating, and it is gross speculation, he ends up speculating that life came from nothing through spontaneous generation. And he explained that by saying, well, how does life spontaneously generate when we know life only comes from life? How did life ever come from non-life? You know what his answer was? Where he began to speculate? Well, at some point in the past, Earth's conditions were different that would have allowed for that. Now, does anybody else see the irony there? I mean, the present is the key to the past. The way it is now is the way it's always been, the way it always will be. Oh, but we spontaneously had life generate because in the past conditions were different. You know, can you say, have your cake and eat it too? I mean, that's what the fellow's trying to do there. It won't work like that. It won't work both ways. You can't do that. It's a contradiction. And so that's what we're looking at, is see which of these viewpoints is better supported by the facts. But you got to understand, when you talk about geology, people are coming at it, creationists, evolutionists, they're coming at it from two totally different worldviews. Evolutionists will always assume that the way it is now is the way it has always been. The creationist, if they are a true biblical creationist, will assume catastrophes. There have been miracles throughout time. You see in Joshua's day, the sun stood still, and in Hezekiah's day, the sundial goes backwards. Those aren't necessarily catastrophes, but just examples of miraculous things involving the earth itself that they're going to cause potential change and change in the processes. And of course, you know, I was talking to someone just a little bit before services tonight. I mean, I'm sure most of us have seen local floods. Seen, no doubt, footage of it. I've never, thankfully, been in a major, even a localized flood. But I've seen that footage on the news, and it's mind-boggling what a flood can do. The power, the massive power in those waters. Even if it's in a big city, that's very local compared to the entire globe. I doubt very seriously that we can even begin to fathom what a global worldwide flood must have been like. on a catastrophic scale, on a scale of how much water that would entail, the water coming up from the deep, as the deep places of the earth are broken up, and I mean earthquakes and you know, just unimaginable. So catastrophism, very, very different viewpoints. Let's go on and talk about some geological gimmickry. What I want to talk about here is this thing often referred to as the geologic column. Many textbooks contain the geologic column in chart form. By the way, I meant to mention this at the beginning. I'll go ahead and say it now. It's a good time. I've told you that most of what we're studying is based on Wayne Jackson's book, The Bible and Science. Very, very excellent book, and a lot of our particular lessons are based off of those. Here's another book. This book, be prepared to make your brain hurt if you read that. We had to read that in preaching school. They still have y'all read that, Scott? I know you're not second year yet, but have you heard anybody say? I imagine they probably will. But Brother Cates has another book called The Noahic Flood. And it's very much like this. Brother Cates was a person, you'd sometimes see Brother Cates and think he wasn't that smart because he's just a country good old guy. That fellow was sharp. And he could take most of what's in this book and he could boil it down and put it on a level where us calves can reach it. And you know, or Brother Keeble used to say, Brother Brinkley would tell him about Brother Keeble telling them, swing your pot low enough so everybody can sop. Brother Cates would swing the pot low enough where even folks like me could sop. And so Brother Cates has a book called The Noahic Flood, and it's very good. But this book is, I mean, you want to talk detail? This Henry Morris is a detail, and a doctor, very, very knowledgeable in hydrodynamics and things like that, just amazing knowledge. That book is amazing, but it will make your brain hurt. I'll just go ahead and tell you. And Brother Cates made us read that entire thing. I still sometimes have nightmares about it. But then there's this one, this little bitty book. And you talk about a book that a lot is packed into a very small book. You could probably read it in one sitting. It's called The Mythology of Modern Geology. It's Wayne Jackson. Brother Jackson, in his book, Science, or The Bible and Science, in the lesson on geology, he references this. And so I thought, man, I sure would like to read that. And I went in the library, and guess what? There it is. I've said before, the Bremen Church is one of the best libraries I've ever seen. So that book's in the library. This book, these both came from our library. I'm going to put them right back. I'm not using them at the moment. I own this one. Again, it still haunts me. But this one I didn't have, and I was very thankful to have a chance to read that. Good stuff about the geologic timetable and the geologic column that we'll be talking about just now. So I just mentioned that, so if you want to do some further study, because, I mean, like, as I'm studying this, I'm driving myself crazy because there's so much I want to say about all this that we just don't have time for. So it's right there. Like I said, I'm going to return those to the library. So if you want to get those, just check them out, and you'll be glad you did. There's a lot of good information there. A lot of textbooks have the geologic column in chart form. Supposedly, this is going to show you the different geologic ages, which represent various life forms, as observed in the fossil record, beginning with the simple and moving up the column. The simplest is deeper in the earth, supposedly. And you go up the geologic column until the highest level is where the highest life forms are, because that's the highest level of evolutionary development. That's the idea. What a lot of people don't realize about this geologic column, there are a few things that you need to realize about this. Number one, most notably, it exists nowhere on Earth except in those textbooks, and now on the internet and some pictures, as I'll show you in just a moment. It's not, would that it were so convenient that little layers were just laid down for us. It's not like that. You see those layers, what appear to be layers or something in the Grand Canyon. That's something different going on. That's not because those are layers of the earth, each representing millions of years of time. This geologic column does not exist except in the textbooks. It is also, we also need to point out, the whole geologic column, folks, is based upon a grand assumption. And you know what that grand assumption is? That you and I, we've evolved from apes, which evolved from lower life forms, which evolved from lower life forms. It's all based upon one big assumption that evolution has occurred. Now, that's faulty reasoning. That's as faulty as it gets. You don't make an assumption and then start building things around that. But that's exactly what has happened with the geologic column. It's also contradicted by numerous facts within the strata, the actual strata of the Earth. A lot of things contradict it. This is one where I was just chomping at the bit because I wanted to talk more about this, but I'm going to mention one example, and then we'll move on. A 2+ billion-year-old geologic column. Now, by the way, scientists are very, very all over the place with the age of the Earth. They can't agree on this. About the only thing they can agree on is that it's millions or billions of years old. But a lot of times I've looked it up, and probably the most common answer I get is somewhere around 4.5 billion years old when you're looking at secular, non-creationist sources. Even a 2+ billion-year-old geologic column would be something like somewhere in the range of 130 feet thick. But the Earth's actual strata is about 25 to 30 feet. Now, how do you fit millions of years into that? You see, the evidence is stacked against it. But sometimes people just don't want to be bothered with the facts. Their minds are made up. There's a section in Brother Jackson's book, the Bible and Science, and it's in this little book. It's in the Mythology of Modern Geology. There's a little section, kind of similar to a chapter, and it's called Great Expectations, Greater Disappointments. And he talks about some things that you would expect. If the geologic timetable were true, and as organisms evolved, layers are formed straight of the Earth, and they build, and so the farther down you go, the older it is, and getting into the millions of years and all that. There are some things that would be true. You would expect to find. Number one, the earliest strata would contain very sparse life forms, especially compared to later ones. There would be a gradual proliferation as you moved up in the geologic column. Number two, the earliest types of life would be exceedingly simple. The earliest types would be simple, with the complexity increasing at higher levels, right? Because they're evolving. Number three, you would expect to begin down at the lowest strata and progress upward, and you would find a largely complete ascending scale of development, right? As creatures evolve. A sequential chain of evolutionary advancement that is documented in the fossil record. And this is where the greater disappointments comes in. Those are the things that you would expect to find. You know how many of those you find to be true? Not a single one. None of that holds true. In fact, you see not a gradual proliferation, you see a sudden explosion of life in the Earth's strata. There's no sparse, early on and then gradual proliferation. How do evolutionists explain that? Sometimes folks want to know. Well, some evolutionists will just say, well, I really don't know. Don't know how to explain that. Some will surmise that perhaps what happened was some organisms evolved in one big, massive step. Okay, like a mutation. You say one big step, but that's totally contrary to the whole uniformitarianism theory. Again, it doesn't work. It's a contradiction. So they can't explain it. The creationists can, very easily. So there's this sudden explosion of life. Number two, what you actually find is that the earliest fossils, in other words, the ones that date back the longest, they're highly complex. There is no creationism explains that perfectly. Record, there is no sequential chain. No sequential chain at all. The fossil record is filled with gaps. There are no transitional forms for these organisms that supposedly evolved into this over here. Where are the transitions? You no doubt have heard people talk about this before. It's one of And why is it not still going on? Why did evolution suddenly stop? That goes completely against uniformitarianism as well. And so, great expectations, greater disappointments. Here's a picture of that geologic column. I know that's small. That's about the best I could do. It was hard to find a high-quality picture of that would, maybe you folks that are closer can see that. You've got the Tertiary period. You've got Cretaceous, Jurassic. I'm having trouble seeing that even on my iPad here. Triassic, Permian, Pennsylvanian, Mississippian, Devonian, Silurian, Ordovician, Cambrian period. And then anything older than that, they just call Precambrian. So, that's in descending order, obviously top to bottom. Top being the most recent. And you see kind of an idea of some index fossils there. But as we mentioned, there are all these expectations, but it's just a disappointment. And I mentioned these already. Sorry about that. I got behind. You see all these gaps. You don't see the transitional forms. You see this sudden proliferation of life, the early complexity of fossils. It doesn't fit the evolutionary model. The evidence is not there. It's also interesting because index fossils, maybe you've heard scientists talk about index fossils. Index fossils supposedly identify these ages of geology. Listen, an index fossil should never appear again because they go extinct or they don't necessarily, I guess they do go extinct, but it's because they're evolving. So this animal has evolved, so he's never going to appear again in the fossil record, right? Wrong. They appear over and over again, sometimes quite often in several places. Evolution can't explain that. Wow, how on earth does an index fossil suddenly show up again? Because it didn't evolve. It was created. Then you got what is referred to often as polystrate fossils. Polystrate fossils. These are fossils that will sometimes extend across geologic layers. Now, you want to mess with an evolutionary scientist's mind, let him find a fossil that extends across strata of the earth. These layers that represent different periods of the Earth's history, several million years apart, supposedly. It won't mess with their minds too much if they're like a lot of these scientists. And it really, I'll be honest with you, and I sometimes I try to be lighthearted, and I'm not trying to make light of it, but sometimes you get so discouraged studying this because it's hard not to lose faith in humanity sometimes when you see the blatant dishonesty in some folks. You find something like a fossil that goes across 5, 6, 7 strata of the earth, that thing ought to tell you something. And you have people that will jump through all kind of intellectual hoops to try to explain that away, instead of looking at where the evidence is screaming and pointing, and that is to a creator. Sometimes these things extend across many layers. Now, you're not going to be impressed with my PowerPoint editing here, but I just give you an example. I had to find a tree that didn't have a lot of background with it, but this is a green tree. Obviously, there would be no leaves on a fossilized tree, but there are trees that are found in the fossil record. Number one, they're found way before trees ever existed because they had not evolved yet, supposedly. And yet they're in those layers. There they are. It's a fossilized tree. No denying it. Some type of upheaval of the earth maybe caused that fossil to be moved. Well, what about uniformitarianism? You see, it's just round and round we go. But number two, there are trees that many times span several layers. You can't explain that, folks. Not only that, humans. To me, the polystrate fossils and this one, humans are supposedly new to Earth. Maybe you've heard scientists say that. Man's a relative newcomer to this planet because, we supposedly are the highest level of evolutionary development. You wonder why people lose morality if you view yourself as just the highest level of evolutionary development, the highest evolved animal on planet Earth, as opposed to created with a soul in the image of God. And we wonder sometimes why folks act out the way they do and just have no moral compass whatsoever. But humans are supposedly new to this earth, but frequently there's evidence in the fossil record, in the strata, of supposedly much older periods of time. I mean, like way, millions of years supposedly, before man had even come onto the scene. But there's evidence. It may be a drawing. It may be a footprint. They had tried to explain away one footprint, and they even did some further testing and showed that there was actually pressure marks, just like what a human footprint would have made. They were trying to explain it away as this or explain it away as that. They're just constantly trying to deny the obvious. Oh, humans are newcomers, but millions and millions of years earlier than man supposedly has evolved. In fact, I want you to see a quote. You talk about losing some faith in humanity and discouraging to hear a doctor, PhD, to say something like this. Commenting on human footprints that were found repeatedly in Carboniferous formations from supposedly 280 million years ago. Like over 100 million years before humans evolved, supposedly. But there's a footprint, a human footprint. They've tested it, they've tried to, we're going to submit it to this guy and he'll show that it's not a human footprint, it just appears to be that way. Or it came along later and it happened to be in the same spot. Over and over again, they do the test, and the honest scientists are saying, folks, this is a human footprint. An evolutionist named Albert C. Ingalls made this statement, just mind-boggling. If man, or even his ape ancestor, or even the ape ancestor's early mammal ancestor, existed as far back as in the Carboniferous period in any shape, then the whole science of geology is so completely wrong that all geologists will resign their jobs and take up truck driving. Hence, for the present at least, science rejects the attractive explanation that man made these mysterious prints in the mud of the Carboniferous period with his feet. And to that, I'll just give you the very next sentence in this. That quote appears in this little book. And I'll give you the very next sentence that Brother Jackson himself typed. And that is, what was that about the objectivity of science? Where is the objectivity? It's been shown time and time again to be a human footprint. And he says, well, if it is, then geology is so wrong, we might as well just quit our jobs. You see? Sometimes people are just not willing to follow the evidence. It's frustrating. Let's go on and talk about fossil facts. Fossil facts. Again, there were things that you see when you look at the fossil record. I've boiled these down to, what have we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've got several, a little bit more information on these. But there is the explosion of life. Again, if evolution were true, we would expect to see different life forms sporadically, gradually appearing, then proliferating. But if the biblical record is true, we would expect to see fossils scattered throughout the geologic column because they were created in 6 24-hour days by the Almighty. And of course, every major invertebrate animal group has been found at the so-called Cambrian level. That tells us something right there. This is to be expected as a result of a global flood. And so the explosion of life forms in the fossil record, it agrees more with creationism than the gradualist evolutionary view. We can talk about the universal complexity of life forms. We mentioned that just a moment ago. In fossil records, that is more indicative of creationism than accidental, blind, progressive evolution. It just fits better. There's a complexity of life. The fossils in the Cambrian period are amazingly complex, and yet if evolution were true, we would expect them to be amazingly simple. But it's not the case. Why? Because they didn't evolve. If evolution were true, we'd expect to find fossilized organisms in various developmental stages, gaps filled in, but they've never discovered organisms with half-formed features. Never. Isn't that interesting? Not one? You expect something there, right? If evolution were true. And of course, the bottom line is it's not. It's just not true. The evidence isn't there. The Bible affirms, though, that everything was created after its kind. And so you'd expect. If evolution was true, we would expect to find thousands of intermediate links between the creatures. Somebody has said that evolution is more a study of gapology than geology. People sometimes talk about the missing link. As Brother Jackson points out in his book, try missing links. They're missing all throughout the fossil record. And so the missing links between different kinds of plants and animals, it argues more for specialized creation than for gradual evolution. There's also this concept of progressive degeneration of the Earth's inhabitants. Again, what's that old saying? Survival of the fittest, right? That's the evolutionary notion. And it operates by means of natural selection, right? That's what we're told. That's what our children are taught in public schools. Survival of the fittest, natural selection. Fitter animals survive, the weaker are eliminated, right? And so the species becomes stronger, hardier over time. So what does the evidence show us in nature? It's quite the opposite, actually. They're not becoming hardier over time, stronger. Pre-flood man lived far longer than modern-day man. You've seen that in Genesis 5. There's evidence even in other places in the world from secular accounts that man lived much longer. You also see the fossil record, and it suggests degeneration. In fact, there's been a lot of, and some people estimate as high as in the 90 percentile, 90% or so, species have gone extinct. When you read passages like Romans 5:12, where he talks about is by one man's sin entered the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. The idea of a fallen world, and there are consequences that go with that. And so the world is being in a fallen world. Sometimes people refer to the Edenic curse, referring back to the Garden of Eden. Paul references this in Romans 8:20, beginning. He says, the creature was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who hath subjected the same in hope. Because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. It's the idea of a fallen creation that is not growing hardier and hardier over time. It's actually degenerating over time. You see this with genetics and things like that. So there's this progressive degeneration. It agrees more with the Bible than with natural selection. I think I'm behind on my clip. There we go. Also, massive fossil graveyards are more consistent with the Bible than with evolution. 70% or so of fossils are sedimentary, water-laid fossils. This is why we even have fossils, because ordinarily an animal dies and sits there, and sometimes you see this on the side of the highway, right? The buzzards come, the crows, and whatever it may be, they come and they're gonna take that. They don't just say, hey, leave it alone, maybe it'll fossilize. Something has to happen, very catastrophic, these things to be buried, and that's how fossils form. Ordinarily, an animal carcass is just going to get eaten. They're not deposited slowly over time. They're deposited very rapidly. All sorts of creatures are in massive burial sites, though. And many times their fossils are all contorted, suggesting they died a very violent death. I wonder what would have done that. Maybe something like a global flood? You get the idea. There's also the identical structure of fossil creatures and their modern counterparts. Again, that argues for stability of kinds, not the transformation of life via evolution. You could compare fossil records with their living counterparts. There's some degeneracy, as we talked about just a moment ago. But structural composition, it's basically the same, folks. In fact, an evolutionist said this. George Gaylord Simpson is the guy's name. He was a very, very renowned evolutionist. He says, quote, an oyster of 200 million years in the past would look perfectly familiar if served in a restaurant today, end quote. They actually make these statements. I mean, sometimes I would read this and I would think, did he really say that? Surely he's not that foolish. Surely he's not that just out there that he would make such a statement that contradicts his own theory. But he did. The fossil record and the strata of earth can best be explained by the Genesis flood of Noah's day. That accounts for the discrepancies. This is where I wish I just had more time. We just don't have it. There are discrepancies that sometimes you'll find fossils all mixed up in the strata. Sometimes, you see, as we mentioned, the tree going across at, one of them was in the Netherlands at a 40-degree angle spanning several layers of the Earth's crust. There are things like that you go, okay, well, whether you're talking creation or evolution, how does that happen? Evolution just has to sit there and go, I don't know. We can't explain that. But the creation account, especially with the Genesis flood, you can explain that. And three things that primarily make it agree more with creationism. The ecological deposits. This basically just says organisms would live in ecological communities, habitats, and things like that. Even today, obviously, dinosaur bones were not typically, especially large flesh-eating dinosaurs, were not typically found right next to human bones. Why? Well, if you lived in a time where there were T-Rexes roaming, are you going to build your house close to one? I mean, do you want to live close to that? They lived in communities, similar ecological habitats and things like that. So that's why you see similar organisms in certain strata, just like today. We don't go and say, hey, I want to live as close as I can to all the dangerous animals. Some people do. But typically speaking, again, there's that grouping. Then there are hydrodynamic forces. And really, this basically says that organisms with high density and structure, and simple structure rather, they're going to settle out more rapidly, and they're buried the deepest. So like trilobites, brachiopods, and things like that, they're very streamlined, and they're very dense, and so they're buried in the lowest strata. That's a very simplified definition of a lot more that he gives in this little book, but a very interesting study there. And Henry Morris, who helped write the Genesis flood, also has a lot to say about that. He has a lot of background studying hydrodynamics. And then there's the mobility differential. Creatures with lesser mobility in a global flood are going to be buried first. Trilobites, things like that. A mollusk. A fish is a little bit more mobile. He can get away better. An amphibian would even be more mobile than that. He might hop out and try to get to high ground. Mammals they're going to head out, get to the high ground. And then birds. Think about something that can fly. They're going to survive even longer. Eventually, it's going to get them. But you see why there's that ascending scale that you sometimes see in the crust of the earth. It's the mobility differential. That makes perfect sense. Well, as we close our thoughts and prepare to extend the invitation, I hope you see the evidence. The evidence is there, and the evidence is not in favor of years and years, and especially billions or millions of years. Nor is the evidence in favor of the present is the key to the past. The evidence is in favor of catastrophism. And just like Peter said, some folks are willingly ignorant of the facts. Some folks just don't know, but some folks are willingly ignorant. But the Lord is not slack concerning his promise. And so as we close our thoughts out, we want to make sure that we understand God is, that he created this earth. And when you look at things through the creationist lens, through the creationist model, it makes sense. It fits the facts. Are we living right with God? Because one day, just like we have his word on how he created this earth, we have his word on his son coming to this earth, giving us instruction, we have his word that one day he's going to come again and this earth will be burned up. We want to look for a new heaven and a new earth because this one's going to be burned up. But the only way to have that hope is to be in Jesus Christ. If we can help you tonight in getting right with him, that's why we extend heaven's invitation. We'll be glad to help you in any way that we can. Won't you come as we stand and sing?